Good morning and welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course Indian Fiction in English. In today's session, we take a look at this brilliant novel written by Amitav Ghosh titled The Shadow Lines. This is considered as one of his best works and also as one of the representative works of this entire genre, Indian fiction in English. We begin taking a look at the background or the context in which the novel was written. This work was written in the aftermath of Sikh riots in Delhi, which was in 1984-85. So, this historical understanding is very important to appreciate some of the episodes of the novel and also to understand even the title, The Shadow Lines, how arbitrary and how unreal they are when we talk about political partitions. This work quite rightfully won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1988, and this was yet another way in which Indian writing in English made its inroads into the general body of Indian writing, Indian literature itself. When we talk about the historical background, there are certain events of national importance which have made their inroads into this narrative, and in that sense it also requires a certain kind of an understanding of events such as Swadeshi movement or the Second World War, partition, the riots in Calcutta and Dhaka in 1964, so on and so forth. So, at some level this is a novel which also takes into account not just events which are part of a national imaginary, but also certain kinds of events which have assumed importance and significance across borders. For example, an event such as a world war or partition, which did not affect just one region or just one nation, but all the nations which were part of, which were sharing the same border. This novel, The Shadow Lines, also has certain unique features, the first of them being an unnamed narrator. There is a narrator who is present right from the beginning till the end of the novel, and he leads us through the various time frames and the various narratives of the novel, the various plot sequences of the novel, but nevertheless we do not get to know the name of the narrator. And this is a very deliberate ploy employed by writers such as Ghosh in order to also indicate that this could be, the narrator could be just about anybody. We of course get to know about the gender of the narrator. He is a male narrator, but we also get to know certain things about his educational qualification, his background, his social background, his family background, the kind of ties that he has at his personal and professional levels, but nevertheless we do not get to know even a little bit of an indication about his name. Though this is written in an experimental fashion in terms of the various time frames which are being brought together within the plot structure, it continues to employ the feature of realism. In that sense, it continues to be seen as a realist novel, and this is also a very unique feature, especially in the post-Rushdie period. Rushdie began experimenting with post-colonialism, postmodernism and magic realism at the same time, and it was only a natural expectation of the reviewers and readers that the post-Rushdie generation, the post-Rushdie writers would also follow suit, and they will engage with the nation through the mode of magic realism. But here we find a writer such as Amitav Ghosh defying these norms and defying these expectations and continuing to write in the age-old form of realism. It engages with the problems of memory, as you would figure out as in when you read the novel. It is mostly about recollections. So, there is a certain kind of failure, there is a certain kind of limitation which is inherent in the aspects of memory. So, these problems, these limitations are also part of the narrative. Interestingly, these the problems and the challenges of recalling or forgetting, they do not hamper the narrative, they do not limit the narrative in any way. On the other hand, they enhance it in multiple ways rather than a unilinear narration. And we also find the emergence of many little histories in this process. As indicated in the beginning, we do have a very definite and a very straightforward engagement with history throughout. There are various real historical incidents which are being referred to, and in this process we find many little histories emerging, and these little histories, which are of personal nature, but they also have a national importance given the context in which these memories are laid out. These little histories, they also begin to challenge the meta narratives of the empire as well as the nation. This is extremely important because there is a certain way in which the novel is set both in the contemporary as well as in a colonial past, because some of the realities related to the riots, the World War, the partition, they are interlinked with the colonial past. So, the novel draws extensively from a colonial past as well as from the contemporary, which is part of the independent nation. So, there are these meta-narratives of the empire and the nation which are always already available, and these little histories narrated by the narrator as well as recalled through the memories of different characters in the novel, they challenge these meta-narratives. We also find temporal slippages in narration. Again, as stated earlier, they do not limit the narrative. On the other hand, they only enhance the multiple ways in which the narrative of the nation is being presented. John Mee, one of the historians and critics of Indian fiction in English, he has identified 3 major time frames in the novel, as and when you begin to read the novel, which you would find that is shifting between different time frames. It will be useful to have these 3 basic frameworks in mind. Every incident which is part of the novel, every plot which is part of the novel falls into one of these 3 time frames. The first one is the warriors when Tridham and Ila are with the Prices in London. The reference is to the Second World War. And the second time frame is the early 1960s, and it lasts almost until Tridham's death. And this is also the phase when we get to know extensively about the narrator's childhood, which forms a major part of the understanding of the novel. And the third part, the third time frame, is the 1980s when the narrator is a student in London, and this is where we also reach the resolution, if you may call it, which is part of the novel. And these 3 time frames are not presented in any particular order, and definitely not a chronological order. On the other hand, we find that it keeps shifting from one time scheme to the other, and also from one location to the other. So, it definitely requires a close reading to identify these major time frames and also put in the particular plots and particular episodes within these 3 time frames. And the novel also has 2 parts which are titled Going Away and Coming Home. The first half is Going Away and the second half is Coming Home. And throughout this narrative, we begin to realize that most of the characters in this work of fiction, they're either going away from home or they're coming home, which is to Calcutta or to Dhaka. And there is this enigma of non-belonging which dominates the entire narrative, and it is part of the characteristic of most of the characters as well. And some of the critics have also felt that perhaps this going away an indication of escaping from home, going away from home, and coming home is in a way coming back to reality. And there is this constant tussle between what is real and what is imagined. Just as Rushdie began to challenge the ideas of the imagined history and the ideas of the real history, we find this same trope being used in rather different ways in Ghosh as well. And there are certain episodes where we almost find it difficult to differentiate between the real incident and the imagined incident, the real person and the imagined person which is there in the narrator's mind. The narrator's memory and his lived experiences, they play a very significant part in even determining whether certain characters and certain kinds of emotions are going away or coming home. The novel itself offers a certain kind of an intervention to while talking about the ideas of going away and coming home. In the novel in page 169, we find this short excerpt which I would like to read out to you. In our family, we don't know whether we are coming or going. It's all my grandmother's fault. But of course, the fault wasn't hers at all. It lay in the language. Every language assumes a centrality, a fixed and settled point to go away and to come back to. What my grandmother was looking for was a word for a journey which was not a coming or a going at all. A journey that was a search for precisely that fixed point which permits the proper use of verbs of movement. Here we find a play with language and also a reference to the Bangla language, and we find that most novels of the post 1980s, they engage playfully with the aspect of language. And here Ghosh is also driving home the idea that even language does not have a fixed meaning. forget about the playfulness of mind and memory, even the language which we take for granted on a day-to-day basis, even the language which we assume have got fixed signifieds and signifiers, even they do not have any fixed meanings. And this is how Ghosh tries to engage with the playful idea of language, to engage with the playful idea of going away and coming home. Even till the end, when the narrator, he is away from home. Temporarily he is away from home, but in a certain way he has also come home. And this is the ambiguity which the novel engages with throughout, leaving us in this difficult position as to decide whether the characters have come home or whether they are still been away. So introducing here, I try to introduce the major characters to you, and there's also the relation between them which is being illustrated over here. So I'll give a brief description of each of the characters and then show this illustration to you again so that it will make more sense to you. I, however, strongly also encourage that you should have a first-hand reading of the novel to be able to appreciate what this illustration is all about. Just a summary will not work. You need to engage with the novel in order to figure out how these lives are intertwined together and how they inhabit different time frames and different temporal spaces and still remain connected to each other, primarily through the idea of memory. So these are the characters. Tama is a major character, and it is almost possible to say that the shadow lines is her story. When we meet her, she is quite old, but we get to know that she is educated, she belongs to the middle class, she is one of those who is aspiring for a better life and also encourages and wishes the same for everyone in her family. She has got a brief stint with the revolution. She had to leave Dhaka when she was very young. She was widowed at 32 and she had a hard life. But nevertheless, she continued to lead her life as a school teacher and later as a headmistress, and we find that she could successfully raise her children and also establish herself in the society. And she comes across as being this hard-working, time-conscious person who continues to remain the same till the end of her life, and according to her, time is like a toothbrush. If you do not use it, it will begin to stink, it will rot away. So that is the idea of time that she has, which is in stark contrast with Tridib, who seems to be whiling away his time according to grandmother. And Tama is also a fiercely independent woman, though she has got radical ideas about what freedom is and what independence is, because though she is the kind of woman who appreciates and who holds her ground for a woman leading an independent life, she is unable to appreciate the kind of life that Ila leads. In fact, her grandmother at some point even ends up calling Ila as a whore. That aside, one of the major episodes of this novel is Tama's mission to bring back her uncle, for which she also pays a visit to Dhaka, which acts like an event of hamartia in Tama's life. And in the course of the novel itself, we also find Tama dying. And there is Maya Devi, who is Tama's sister, and she's also married to Sahib. And we also find a certain kind of a family friendship between Maya Devi's father-in-law and Tresausen, which is the family is also referred to as the Prices. The other significant character is the narrator. We get to know from the narrative that he was born in 1952, and he is introduced as a collector and a filterer of stories, and he also has an intimate knowledge of the colonizers' world because he engages with history, with the maps, with the atlases, with the stories of the past, and of course he engages actively with the stories which are narrated to him by Tridib when he was a child. He also prefers and privileges an imaginary past rather than living in the real, and this is something that he also inherited from the older people that he interacted with, such as Tridib and grandmother, and also with Ila, who is his peer and also someone towards him he develops a sort of an infatuation at a later point. And this narrator, who remains unnamed, he also has this uncanny ability to trace the events of the past, though he has not witnessed any. So we find him recreating many events and incidents of the past of which he was never a part of. And this could be partly attributed to the wonderful narratorial skills of Tridib, and also partly to the great imaginative faculty that the narrator himself possessed. He is so fascinated with the atlases and maps that it also becomes an important image in the novel, and also encourage you to take a look at Mukerjee's essay Maps and Mirrors, where she looks at the maps and mirrors as coordinates of meaning in the shadow lines. Tridib is another significant character whom we meet mostly, almost throughout, through the eyes of the narrator. Narrator encounters him when he was a child, and he has such a fascination for Tridib, who is an uncle to him, and he continues to remain fascinated with Tridib and his lives and his stories till the end. Tridib dies in the course of the novel, and the resolution of the novel is also related to how the narrator comes to terms with the context and some of the context of Tridib's death. Tridib is Maya Devi's son, and he is an archaeologist. He leads his life as a bohemian. He had spent his childhood in England. We get to know that he was in love with May, and he is also the one who teaches the narrator that places do not exist and they have to be invented. That is another fresh perspective that this novel brings to us, and this we find being presented in stark contrast when we look at narrator's life and Ilah's life. Narrator has not visited most of the places, but all those places exist for him because he had invented them in his imagination. On the contrary, Ilah is someone who had a life in which she had to travel extensively because her father used to get posted in different parts of the world. But nevertheless, her imaginative faculty and her capacity to engage with places was so limited that she lived a life which looked almost as if she had never travelled at all. There is May Price, with whom Tridib had a relation, and we also find that the narrator becomes involved with her towards the end, which also leads to the resolution of the novel in certain ways. And Ilah is another fierce woman character in this novel, who is part of almost all the characters in direct or indirect ways. She is a granddaughter of Maya Devi, and she is also a cosmopolitan person, and she is a daughter of an Indian diplomat named Jatin. She has a very different kind of a migrant experience, and the narrator often feels about her that although she has lived in many places, she had never travelled at all. So the many shifts from one place to the other had not really affected her experience or her migrant experience in any way. And it's possible to say that she is one of those who is caught in this third space, and she can be seen as a hybrid subject. And what makes her very different is also the fact that she leaves India to be free, because she says explicitly that she wants to be free of India. And there is this incident, if you recall from the novel, happens at the Grand Hotel, where she has this traumatic explosion, and she says that this is precisely why she wanted to leave India, because she wanted to be free of India. And here I also wanted to take a very quick look at the idea of freedom as it is presented by characters such as Ilah and grandmother, because both of them are very strong female characters, but they have very different ideas about freedom, and they do not really come together at any point. Ilah on the one hand wants to be free of India, its people, its customs, traditions, restrictions, regulations, hierarchies and bondings, which she feels is very restrictive to her and will not allow her, especially as a woman, to be free. Grandmother, on the other hand, though she has lived a fiercely independent life, she feels that the idea of freedom that Ilah has is very skewed. And according to the grandmother, Tama, freedom is something that one has to earn. It's like a right. So I read to you from page 77-78 of the novel Shadow Lines, where grandmother has this extensive discussion with the narrator about what she thinks is freedom and how she maintains that Ilah does not have the right to live in any other country other than the one in which she was born. Ilah has no right to live there. There is England. It took those people a long time to build that country, hundreds of years, years and years of war and bloodshed. Everyone who has lived there has earned their right to be there with blood, with their brother's blood and their father's blood and their son's blood. They know their nation because they have drawn their borders with blood. So this is very interesting because grandmother seems to have such a violent kind of conception about how borders are drawn, and blood in certain ways is not a negative thing for her, but it is a positive reinforcement for laying one's claim to a land and also accessing the kind of freedom that each land offers to its people. The idea of childhood emerges as a significant theme throughout, because when we meet the narrator, we meet him as a very young child, and we begin to see the world, we begin to see the characters through the eyes of this narrator who is still a young child. And the narrator also has a different way of looking at the world, because he looks at the world through Tridib's eyes. In his own words, Tridib had given me worlds to travel in, and he had given me eyes to see them with. And we do find this being a kind of a limitation in certain aspects, but it also, as noted earlier, it enhances the narrative possibility of this work of fiction in multiple ways. And we also find that the narrator is being strangely possessive of Tridib, his memory, his life in a way that only a child can be. Even after he's grown up, there's a way in which he continues to feel that he has the sole right to Tridib's world and Tridib's memory and Tridib's life. There is this instance where he admits, I was jealous, achingly jealous, as only as a child can be, because it had always been my unique privilege to understand Tridib. And that day at the Victoria Memorial, I know I had lost that privilege. Somehow May had stolen it from me. I leave it to you to go read the novel and understand what happened at the Victoria Memorial. It was a very significant incident in the novel. And that is one instance where the narrator also realizes that he shares something very incredible with May Price. And there are also certain fears which are being instilled in the narrator's mind, and when he, such as Tridib's narration about the circumcision rites of some desert tribes, and there is a castration fear which is introduced into the narrator as a child, and we find it getting reflected in some of his interactions with Ila as well. As a child, our narrator has got exotic relatives, and all of them cannot be reduced to blood relatives. That is how the title becomes all the more significant over here, because certain lines are like shadow lines. They are very arbitrary, and it's difficult to say whether they are real or unreal. And as a child, when the narrator compares himself with Ila or Nick, he feels very inferior, and in certain ways we find that some of those complexes stay with him for a long time. This is particularly evident in the instance where Ila talks to the narrator about her boyfriend back in England, who is Nick. And though the narrator had never met Nick, there is a way in which Nick becomes a very strong presence in his life throughout his adolescent years. And in his own words, after that day, Nick Price, whom I had never seen and would, as far as I know, never see, became a spectral presence beside me in my looking glass, growing with me, but always bigger and better, and in some way more desirable. I did not know what, except it was so in Ila's eyes, and therefore true. An interesting feature here is that, just like the narrator began to see the world through Tridib's eyes, there are many other places and many other people that the narrator begins to meet through Ila's eyes as well. So though this entire novel is narrated from a single person's point of view, which is the narrator who remains unnamed, we also get to see the world through the other's eyes, because that is how the narrator had always been seeing the world and had always been approaching the people and places around him. And finally, even when we approach the instance where Tridib's death is being talked about, and there's a certain resolution which needs to be brought in for that particular event, we find that there is a very strong reason for bringing in childhood as a theme, because only when we try to see Tridib and the life that he lived through the eyes of the narrator, who's a child, the entire sequence of events seem to make sense. The novel itself is very conscious about the idea that the shadow lines are unreal and arbitrary. There is this segment where one of the characters, Jeta Moshai, he says, once you start moving, you never stop. It's all very well, you're going away now, but suppose when you get there, they decide to draw another line somewhere. What will you do then? Where will you move to? no one will have you anywhere. So this is when Tama, the grandmother, goes to pick Jetamoshai, her uncle, from Dhaka, and they also have such poignant discussions about the partition, about the shadow lines which are drawn between two lands in a rather arbitrary way. There could be political reasons, but personally it makes no sense to two common people who are separated due to certain political turbulences which they could never understand, and they fail to understand even at a later point. Here it is also important to recall Saadat Hasan Manto and his views on partition, and we briefly read from Toba Tek Singh, one of the best written partition short stories ever. And if you are familiar with the story, you would know that it is also one of the best novels which has taken a sarcastic take against the event of partition and trying to narrate it in the context of a lunatic asylum. And right from the beginning of the narration in the short story Toba Tek Singh, there is this confusion about where a certain place Toba Tek Singh is. So we have this character who is supposedly from a place named Toba Tek Singh, and since he always talks about this place, he himself, the character himself, gets named as Toba Tek Singh. He is in a lunatic asylum and they are about to get a partition, and they need to choose whether they will be in India or in Pakistan. And I read this excerpt to you. Now he began asking where Toba Tek Singh was to go, but nobody seemed to go where it was. Those who tried to explain themselves got bogged down in another enigma. Sialkot, which used to be in India, now was in Pakistan. At this rate, it seemed as if Lahore, which was now in Pakistan, would slide over to India. Perhaps the whole of India might become Pakistan? It was also so confusing, and who could say if both India and Pakistan might not entirely disappear from the face of the earth one day? This story, written in 1955, it also reflects similar kinds of disturbances and articulations about the entire arbitrariness with which certain lines are drawn across borders. There are also certain interesting episodes throughout this novel. We will not go into the details of those. There is a failure of the narrator's meaning making exercises, especially towards the end when he tries to make sense of the riot. He accesses the newspaper reports, which he also finds are being tampered with, are flawed. The events that he recalled from his memory and the newspaper reports do not seem to match with each other. Grandmother's take on freedom and nationalism, they make an interesting discussion almost throughout, and Ela's and narrator's worlds are poles apart, and at some level in a certain episode, Ela even feels that nothing really important happens where you are, and it's in these instances that narrator also feels othered in multiple ways. Though Ela and narrator are related by blood, though they share the same bloodline and they belong to the same ethnicity, he finds that the worlds are so different that it becomes difficult to merge them together again. And narrator's encounters with May also begin to shape up the novel in multiple ways and give a sense of resolution to it, as we have mentioned before. And Ela's relationship with Nick, whom she also marries eventually, that's also a reflection of the ideas of third space, about the diasporic anxieties. And we also find that May and grandmother, one is an English woman and the other is an Indian woman who moved from Dhaka, but we find that both of them are equally foreign and alien in Dhaka. So there are these very interesting things that the novel pursues, and it would be very interesting for us also to engage with certain discussions around these aspects. As we begin to wrap up, I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that there is a short novel by Joseph Conrad published in 1917, which is titled The Shadow Line, and some of the critics feel that the novel Shadow Lines, it could be seen in the context of Conrad's work as well. Conrad talks about an invisible line that divides youth from maturity, and he also talks about the crossing over and the opposition between the Orient and Europe. If you are aware of the context in which Joseph Conrad was writing, you would also understand what he means when he talks about the Orient and also about the Europe in the context of colonization. As we wrap up this lecture, I leave you with this very brilliant review by Meenakshi Mukerjee. She wrote this essay, The Anxiety of Indianness, where she argued that most Indian writers writing in English, they have an anxiety to present Indianness to the Western audience. And towards the end of this essay, she comments and she rather very succinctly puts it that Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines is one novel which does not betray any kind of this anxiety, which is more than evident in most of the other works. To read her own words, Amitav Ghosh, The Shadow Lines, is the one novel written in the 1980s that will survive all the rest that appear in the boom decade. The novel betrays no anxiety because it attempts to prove nothing and interrogates rather than defines the concept of a totalizing India. And this is a befitting tribute to this novel, The Shadow Lines. And this also continues to be one of those very few novels which is accepted by one and all, and it continues to remain the favorite of critics and readers all over, especially in the context of Indian fiction in English. What we have done today is to give a brief outline and also a background and context to the reading of The Shadow Lines. We do have 2 student presentations coming up where they will talk about certain specific aspects about the novel and also engage in detail with certain select instances from the novel. Before that, I again encourage you to take a look at the novel, read it in original so that you would also appreciate the many discussions that we have as part of this. I thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.